Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Let Them Eat in Peace, Meal and Rest Period Laws for Healthcare Workers, presented by Alexis James with WorkWise Law. Please be aware that there will be a question and answer portion today at the end of the webinar. To avoid frequent interruptions during the webinar, please type your questions in the question box located on the right of your screen. They will be answered in the order received during the question and answer portion. Additionally, the presentation slides will be emailed to all participants following the completion of today's webinar. They can also be found in the handouts pane over on the right of your screen, and a recorded version will also be available on the website for members only. Again, we would like to thank you for attending, and I will now turn things over to Alexis.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Alexis James. My firm is WorkWise Law. And I realized this morning the irony of doing a webinar called Let Them Eat in Peace during your lunches. So I apologize for the fact that I'm disturbing your lunch, but hopefully we're going to go over information in this next hour that's going to make your lives a lot easier. It's better to ensure that you have compliant practices with regards to meal and rest periods, rather than having to deal with it in the form of a lawsuit or a labor claim. It really upends your life for, upwards of a year when you're having to go back through all your payroll records and depositions and things of that nature. So today we're going to go over the basics of what the law requires and how to audit your procedures and some best practices to put in place. And I'll talk about some of the ways that medical practices get into trouble, things that I've seen in my experience. So, as you know, hospital and medical practice life is chaotic and ever-changing. You have very fluid days where it's sometimes hard to plan for things like scheduled breaks. And it's easy if you don't have the right tools in place to unintentionally violate labor code laws. So I'm not going to be a proponent of saying there will never be a day where you can't properly schedule your rest and your meal periods, but you do need to have the tools in place to properly pay those mealtime penalties so that you don't get hit with that later. So let's jump into what the basic regulations are. With regard to meal periods, it's Labor Code Section 512 and the Industrial Wage Order Section 5, Section 11D. And with rest breaks, it's Labor Code Section 226.7. So the first one, Labor Code Section 512, says that in California, an employer may not employ an employee for a work period of more than 5 hours without a 30-minute meal period, except that if the work period is no longer than 6 hours, the meal period may be waived by the mutual consent of both the employer and the employee. So if you're scheduled for 6 hours only, the person can waive their 30-minute meal period. Otherwise, you do need to make sure that they receive 30 minutes uninterrupted. A second meal period of not less than 30 minutes is required if the employee works more than 10 hours per day. And the law used to be that if the employee worked no more than 12 hours, they could waive that second meal period. And there was litigation brought in the healthcare arena, a case called Gerard versus Orange Coast Memorial Med Center last year. And the Supreme Court ruled that healthcare workers may voluntarily waive their second meal period on shifts that last more than 12 hours. So to break that down, they can't waive both of their meal periods. They can waive one or the other, but it is now allowed under California law, if their shift is longer than 12 hours, it's still okay for them to waive that second meal period. So one thing to do is to go back and look at your handbook policies and your meal period waivers and make sure that it is compliant with this new case. A lot of the waivers that I've seen had the old language that said you can't waive it if it's up to 12 hours. So you would want to amend that. With regards to relieving your employees for their 30-minute meal period, you don't have to drag them out of their workstations. Thankfully, there was a case a few years ago that clarified what an employer's obligations are. You just need to make sure that their job duties are completely relinquished, that they have control over their meal period, that they have the right to leave your facility, and that goes for rest periods as well. That's another area where I've seen a lot of mistakes in handbooks, is that it requires employees to stay on the premises during their rest periods, and that's one surefire way to get yourself in trouble. So you can still require that your employees be back on time from their rest period, so it might not be reasonable for them to leave the facility, but you have to at least give them that option. If you cannot relieve your employees for that 30-minute meal period, it's going to be considered an on-duty meal period. And that means that the employer has to pay 1 hour as a meal premium for not relieving their employee during that time. An employee can volunteer to have an on-duty meal period, but only when the nature of the work prevents them from being relieved of all duties, and when there's a written agreement between the employer and an employee on the job paid meal period that's agreed to. So, sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. Let me come back to that meal period in a second. So we covered Section 512, and we covered the industrial wage order, which allows you now to have that second waiver if it goes longer than 12 hours. With regard to rest periods, again, the section is Labor Code Section 226.7, and this says that employers must provide rest periods of 10 minutes, depending on the amount of time worked. So if an employee works up to 4 hours, they need to be provided with a 10-minute paid rest period. Excuse me. If they only work 3.5 hours in their shift, you do not need to provide that 10-minute paid period. But again, you want to relieve them of all duties. You want to make sure that they can leave the facility if they want, and they can't be on call for any reason. There was a big case in California, Augustus versus ABM, and it had to do with security guards that had to keep their walkie-talkies on them while they were on their rest and their meal periods. And the court found that the employees were not actually being relinquished of all their job duties by having to have this, basically this paging system on their person. And it resulted in a $90 million judgment against the company, just the mere fact that they had these walkie-talkies. So you want to let your employees know that during these rest periods and these meal periods, they are absolutely free from any control. And if you hear that a manager is preventing them or discouraging them from taking that meal break, you need to counsel that manager and make sure they know that that could be subjecting you to liability for failure to relinquish their meal period. The ways that employers get in trouble is stacking rest and meal periods. We hear this a lot in litigation, that the employee says, well, they weren't scheduled for a 10-minute and a 30-minute, so I just joined them together. That's not lawful under California law, so make sure that there's no stacking of the rest and the meal periods. Also, with regards to standing waivers, because the court is looking at whether it's voluntary on the part of the employee, they discourage the use of standing waivers, because a lot of employees will come back later and say, oh, I think I signed a waiver during my onboarding and I didn't really realize that it was in effect all this time, and now I wish that I would have had my meal periods for the last 3 years. And unless the employer can really demonstrate that the employee had entered into this voluntarily, it's not going to look good to have one waiver that is in place for many years. So we recommend with our clients that you get daily waivers if that's going to be a practice. It just shows that every day the employee is realizing that they're giving up their right to take that break and that they are assenting to it. Another area where employers get into trouble is requiring on-duty meal periods that don't meet objective standards. So the court is looking at whether the job duties were such that the person really could not be relieved during their day for their meal period. And some of the examples that the court has given is like a security guard at a remote location, or someone who's at a kiosk on the graveyard shift who's alone who can't be relieved. Those would be objectively valid waivers for someone who has to stay on duty during that meal period. The fact that you just have a busy medical practice and patients are stacking up and things are falling behind, maybe on a sporadic basis that will be okay to have that on-duty meal period, but certainly not an everyday occurrence. I was just dealing with a small medical practitioner's office where they said, well, every day is busy like that, and so every day we need to have that on-duty meal period. And because there were enough nurses to schedule and stack the breaks, I told the employer that they were potentially going to be liable for using those on-duty meal periods, that it wasn't going to meet the factors. So they started scheduling everyone on the stacked system. Okay, one of the other ways that employers can get in trouble is having people skip their meal periods and then leave early. You can't do that. For example, we talked about if the day is only 6 hours, the person can waive their ability to have that 30-minute meal period. That is true, but you can't just let them leave at 5 hours and 30 minutes into their shift. It seems a little counterintuitive, but leaving early is not something that's favored under this law. So I had jumped ahead. I said, when can you use the waiver? Not more than 6 hours in a shift. Get individual waivers, don't have staff waivers. Also, tell your employees that they have the right to revoke it at any time. So if you do have a practice where waivers are being used for 6-hour shifts quite frequently, maybe in a quarterly staff meeting, you would bring up the fact that the employees do have the right to revoke it, and make sure that you're documenting that you told them that. Give them reminders that they have the power to revoke that waiver. All right, here's the unfun stuff. The fines that employers pay for missed meal periods and statute of limitations issues. So when an employer fails to provide an employee with a meal period, they have to pay 1 additional hour of pay at the employee's regular rate of pay for each workday that the meal period is not provided. Similarly, if they miss a rest period, the employer has to pay 1 full hour for that missed rest period. So hypothetically, if your employee missed a rest period and a meal period in 1 day of work, they are subject to 2 hours of premium pay for those missed breaks. That can really add up. So you want to make sure that you get those 10 minutes in, because having to pay an hour plus potential penalties, attorney's fees, these PAGA lawsuits can be extremely expensive to defend. You know, it's worth it to pay the premium pay rather than get yourself into that issue. So we recommend doing an annual audit of your policies and procedures. And like I said, I'm seeing mistakes in employee handbooks where some of the older policies say that the employee has to stay on site for their rest period, or waivers that don't take into effect these new laws. So you want to review your employee handbook and clean up the language, and review your meal period waivers. Additionally, if you have standing waivers, I think it's a good idea to change that practice and make it more of a daily occurrence. And you want to train your managers. Managers are the #1 subjectors of liability, only because they don't know all of these crazy legal requirements. And so they're going off of previous practices or not being updated on these changes in the law. So it's really important that you train your managers on these various nuances and the fact that, if somebody needs to take their 10-minute rest period, it needs to be scheduled halfway through a 4-hour shift. Many managers don't realize that. And so they might have someone take their 10-minute break right when they get to work or at the very end of the 4 hours. The law really wants you to schedule those breaks as far as practicable in the middle of that 4-hour shift. So talk to your managers about scheduling that or potentially looking into electronic technology that gives people their warnings of when a break needs to be taken. There's some really great apps now that allow employers to set the time, and it gives the employee a little text or a page that says, okay, now it's time for your break. When you're auditing your meal periods, you want to look through real-time figures. So sometimes a manager for an entire shift will fill out the break schedule, and it looks like every single employee took their break between 12 and 12:30. If you're looking at that for 6 months, you know that that's not a realistic time frame. You want to have real figures, and so it's better to have your employees figure out, to notate when they go out on their breaks. Make sure that it's real time, not someone signing off that they got from 12 to 12:30. So there's been some updates with regard to lactation breaks in California. Employers are required to provide break times for expressing milk, and the break time shall run concurrently with any break time that's already provided. So you can ask your employees that are expressing milk to try the best that they can to do that during their 10-minute or their meal period times. If that is not possible, you do need to provide them with additional rest periods, although it would be unpaid. And the employer is not required to provide break time for this purpose if it would seriously disrupt the employer's operations. I can see that in a medical practice, if someone's in surgery and it's not practicable to relieve them for that, you can deny the employee that additional break. But obviously, because this is such a litigious state and there's gender discrimination, you would want to accommodate as best you can. So think about those things. All right, so I think we've covered the basics. If anyone has questions, I can answer them now.
Thank you, Alexis. Let me check and see if we have some questions. So we do have a couple. The first one is, will these slides be available after the webinar? And the answer is yes. I will send them all to you through an email. You can also find them on the handouts page on the right of your screen. And the next question is, if I have an employee that is only working 6 hours and goes over by 10-15 minutes, maybe because of a minute task, are we obligated to pay a penalty? Is there any cushion?
There is no cushion. It's a hard and fast 6-hour rule. So if you're at 6:01, it's better to pay the penalty, which I know seems unfair, but they have to draw the line somewhere. So 6 hours is the hard line, at least according to the DLSE.
And the next question is, do we need to provide a room for lactation?
So yes, the requirement is that it not be a bathroom stall and that it be an area that is close to where the employee's regular work is performed, and that it's somewhere where there can be a lock and uninterrupted time. So yes, you would want to try and designate a locked space where the employee can express milk that's not a bathroom.
The next question is, are a lot of the CA regulations similar to the other states?
I can only speak to the California regulations because I'm licensed in California. I'm not licensed in other states. The federal requirements are somewhat similar, but California is very protective of employees, and there's some broader protections for California employees.
Thank you. The next question is, how do you suggest getting the daily waiver?
that you have a staff meeting rolling out the new procedure, and that if someone wants to avail themselves of that time, that you make those forms available either by the shift manager or the office manager, and that if they do want to partake in that, they do need to sign a daily waiver.
If an employee is allowed to leave the premises during a break that is paid, what if they get into a car accident? Would it be workers' comp?
If they're not doing any performance of a job duty and it's on their time, no, it would not be workers' comp. Yeah, no, it would not be. You'd have to show that they were doing the performance of their job duties.
If you're giving them the opportunity to take a break and they are not, or they are just not clocking in and out, do we have to pay the hour of pay?
That's a really good question. So the Brinker case said that the employer does not have to police the break. However, if they know or should know that work is being performed during that break and they're basically accepting of that work, then they do need to pay the penalty. So again, you want to reiterate with your managers and your employees that this is your time. We have no expectation of you doing any work during your rest or your meal period time. We are providing this to you. We want you to take it. But if you interrupt those breaks and just say, oh, I just had a quick call, or I just had a quick task, just realize that you're opening yourself up to liability, and it's best to pay that mealtime penalty.
Can an employee waive a meal penalty if they voluntarily choose to go after the 5th hour?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite understanding that question. If they decide to work longer than 6 hours, can they waive that penalty? Is that the question?
It was, can an employee waive a meal penalty if they voluntarily choose to go after the 5th hour? She also just replied yes to what you had just repeated.
No, they cannot do that.
Okay, and the next question is, the break period has to be scheduled, question mark. The employees are given the choice to take their breaks at their own time. Will this be sufficient?
I think that there needs to be a little bit more oversight. Just speaking from being proactive, you want to be documenting the fact that you gave your employees their breaks. If it's really up to them and you notice a pattern of them taking it towards the end of their shift or not taking it at all, you would want to put some steps in place to ensure that everyone's getting that break towards the middle of their shift as much as you can.
Lunch must be taken by 5 hours or you owe them 1 hour of regular pay, question. Does that 5 hours include their break?
Does that include their break? Yes. Yes, that would include their break. And yes, you have, sorry, repeat the question.
It was, lunch must be taken by 5 hours or you owe them 1 hour of regular pay. Does that 5 hours include their break?
By the end, yes. It must be taken by the end of the 5th hour. So for example, if someone's starting at 7 a.m., they would have to begin their lunch period by 11:59. So before that 6th hour of work.
Okay. Occasionally we have working lunches, but our lunches are only 30 minutes. Do I have to pay 1 hour penalty even though our lunches are a half an hour?
Yes.
Okay. I came in a bit late, so I apologize if this was covered. What if you schedule lunch and the staff member always works through lunch?
So again, you don't have to drag them away from their workstation, but if you know or should have known that they're performing work and you're sort of accepting the work that's being performed, you may be subjecting yourself to liability. It's kind of a gray line as to what the employer must do. But the best thing is just to reiterate that they are free to take that meal period, that you encourage that, and there's no expectation of any work being done. We've added some language into employee handbooks, just a standard statement that, you know, these are your these are your rest and meal periods by law, and our expectation is that you not do any work for us. And if anyone is requiring you to do work, to please notify management. I also have clients that at the end of each pay period, there's a statement when they sign their time cards with an advisement of what the rest periods and meal periods are that they're entitled to, and a statement that says, I've received all of my meal and rest periods during this pay period time, and if not, I've notified my manager. It's just another piece of protective documentation that you can use.
Thank you. And the last question we have here is, should an employee document their 10 minutes break?
So they are not required to by law, but in a lawsuit, you have to show that everyone received their breaks. And so it's difficult if you're not documenting that to do so in a way that demonstrates to the court that you've done it appropriately. So it's not required. I know it's a hassle, especially, clocking in and out. But you would want to have some documentation that everyone is receiving their breaks. And again, that signing off on the pay period statement, that's some good documentation for you.
The next one is, I know this sounds bad, but we have employees that use the restroom outside of our office and are gone for 10 minutes. Is this considered a break?
So using the restroom is not considered a rest break. It's basically your employees are allowed to use the restroom as they see fit. Obviously, if someone is spending 10, 15 minutes multiple times a day, it might warrant a discussion about whether they need accommodation of their schedule for some other problem going on. But no, they're considered two distinct breaks.
Okay, thank you. If there are any further questions, please type them now. I have one that says, can you repeat the pay period statement again?
Sure. So some of our clients, when their employees are submitting their time cards for their pay period, they sign a statement that details what the California provided rest and meal periods are. And it's just an acknowledgement that they've received those rest and meal periods. And if not, they've notified their manager.
Thank you.
And if anyone wants me to send them a copy of that language, I'm happy to do that. Bria, maybe I can email that to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone would like that, you could just send an email to your state MGMA email, and I'll be happy to get that to you. And the next question was, as a reminder, an employee cannot leave a half hour early if they do not take their full 1 hour break, ?
Correct.
Okay, so if there are no further questions for the day, then we can wrap this up. The presentation slides will be emailed to all participants and will be available on our website. If you have any additional questions for Alexis, please reach out directly. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you, Alexis, for a great presentation. I hope you all have a great day.
My pleasure. Thank you.